So we're going to do something a little different today. Now, normally this channel, you'll find keynotes and tutorials and things like that. And now, obviously, that's content that I love to produce. But what I love even more is I love design. I love creating products that really help people. And one of the things that I've realized that I haven't actually ever really done is to talk about any of the work that I've done as I've gone through my career. Well, so in this video, what I want to do is I want to give you a behind-the-scenes look at all the work that went into what's probably one of the favorite projects that I've ever had, which was the creation of the Starwood Preferred Guest mobile app and the Apple Watch app. To give you a behind-the-scenes look at what did it really take to be able to bring that to life and to be able to get it out to the world. So I think this will hopefully be interesting, give you a different look into my process, and I think hopefully we'll have a little bit of fun while we do it. Let's get into it. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Crazy One. Well, like I said, today I want to do something a little bit different. And I think, you know what, historically, I've never talked about sort of the process that went into my design work or any of the stuff that has ended up in my portfolio, because I think for a long time, I always really felt like it just wasn't that interesting. I'd watch other people on stage who would sort of talk about it or do things like that. And either it felt like they did it for their ego, or sort of like they were giving you yesterday's winning lottery numbers. That here's what somebody did on a project that you're not a part of, at a company that you're not at a time that you're not in, and produced something you're not a part of. And so it's sort of interesting and a historical look back, but I never felt like it really came together in a way that really gave you an insight about maybe a different approach or a different way of doing things. So I want to try to change that today, because I think I've sort of become part of the problem where too often I've just talked about the result and really left out the process and all the work and partnership and teamwork and trust that went into being able to bring that work to life. So that's what we're going to do today, is I want to give you a behind-the-scenes look at just sort of what were the challenges that we were up against, the process that we went through, the work that resulted, some of the approaches that we took that I think hopefully are things that you could even be able to apply to the work that you're doing today. But I also want to be really, really clear before I start to get into this work. I'm going to be the narrator for this. But by no means does that mean that what we see here was just the result of what I did. This work never would have seen the light of day if it wasn't for the amazing design team that I was able to work with and lead, the amazing partners that we had in product, in engineering, in the leadership on the digital team, all the way up into the CEO of the company, who really made this possible. Because I think that often is the ingredient that gets left out of this. But like I said, I also just want to be clear that just because I'm the one who's going to narrate this story, I want to make sure that, again, I take the time to be able to give credit to all those other people that did the work, that were a part of what this was, because it really was that partnership and that work that really let it come to life. So with that, let's jump in and take a look at what went into making the Starwood Preferred Guest mobile apps and the Apple Watch app. So let's actually start at the beginning. So I spent 9 years at Starwood. I led the digital design, content, and film and video teams. We had 12 different design-led lifestyle brands, and for the digital work we did, we actually did that work in more languages every day than the United Nations, doing it in 14 different languages. I also led, in its totality, all of the design work across all the different channels for the Starwood Preferred Guest as the loyalty program. But it really actually starts here, because whenever I joined Starwood, I was living in Texas. And they wanted to be able to obviously move me back to New York, where the office was. And through the process of doing that, one of the things that I've always been is really just obsessed with understanding who I'm designing for. So instead of taking corporate housing, what I did was I actually had them put me up here at the Westin Governor Morris in Morristown, New Jersey. I stayed here for 364 days, finishing out that move. So 1 day short of a year. But why this is important is that most of the time whenever I was there, I spent a lot of times in the nights and the evenings and weekends sitting here. Because the front desk sat just behind that seat. And what it let me be able to do was to sit there and listen. Listen to the goings-on, the problems, and the stresses of people checking in, checking out, and just the things that happen during their stay. Because I understood travel through my own stay at a hotel. But for a lot of people who traveled with us, it was different. There are people who stayed 200, 300, 400 nights a year. And it actually is possible to stay more than 350, 365 days in the year if you book multiple hotel rooms. But this is what we were dealing with. It was just a different experience, and I really wanted to understand that. But whenever it came to then working on the apps, I think one of the first things really was looking at just sort of what were we up against? Because I think it's important to understand the moment that we were in. And in the moment we were in, we were facing, honestly, a lot of different challenges. I think we had seen a lot of increasing competition. We'd seen everything from Orbitz to Hilton to Airbnb really coming into the space and trying to disrupt it, trying to take it in a different direction. And honestly, we weren't competing with it terribly well. The consumer behavior that we were trying to design for was insanely complex, because if you think about it, maybe you had to go to Detroit, and we saw you would go there once a month, and you would stay at a Four Points when you were there. Well, that was the thing. Maybe you didn't like Four Points or Detroit. Maybe that was where your company's headquarters were and you had to go there once a month. So understanding that difference between when somebody traveled for business or with their family or to go have an adventure or to just go have a relaxing vacation, figuring out the cues for that to try to be able to create a personalized experience was pretty hard. In many cases, also, the customer data that we were dealing with was either outdated or was just wrong. There had been years of neglect where we would capture information whenever you had signed up for the program. But in many cases, the preferences, maybe even where you lived or things like that, was out of date, which meant if you were trying to build a personalized experience on this data, what we found was that time and time again, those experiences just didn't work, and they weren't that sort of magical, insightful, helpful, value-driven experience. And they just felt more like bad marketing because we were saying, hey, we know this about you, and what we knew wasn't right. I think our brand architecture was confusing because Starwood was a collection of a lot of different brands that all had their own logos, their own branding, their own personalities. And so for a lot of consumers, they knew us as Westin or Sheraton or St. Regis or W. In many cases, they didn't understand that the Starwood Preferred Guest program was what bound them together, or since we weren't, I don't know what, Westin by Starwood or Sheraton by Starwood, there wasn't that sort of association. So the brand architecture was our greatest strength in that everybody knew these strong individual brands, but it was also one of our biggest obstacles because there just wasn't much of any connective tissue between them. I think, the mobile experiences that we had built up until that point were honestly just painfully slow. Whenever you would hit search, it would take 10 or 15 seconds to get results back, to be able to actually be able to get something that was usable. It just, again, this wasn't creating a good and a viable experience. And so the results of that, I think, not surprising, was that the revenue and the brand loyalty was dropping because, again, we had more competition. The experiences we were putting out there weren't what they needed to be. And as a result, then not surprisingly, we had a 2-star rated app. People were frustrated. They were looking for us to be able to do something better, and we weren't coming through with it. And I think more than anything, I was here. I had been at that point at the company for 3 years. I felt very lost, very frustrated, and at that moment had sort of started interviewing because for me, honestly, I really thought that it was time to leave. Now, I bring up that moment 3 years in where I was lost, frustrated, and wanted to leave because I do think there is also an important lesson to be learned here. Because for me, in many cases, that was sort of the history and the pattern that a lot of sort of creative people go through is you get a job, you get to a place where something gets frustrating. It gets hard. And in a lot of cases, the problem is what we do is we pack up and we leave. And I think that's the hard part, is that then we go to a new company, the cycle starts all over again, and we're up against some new challenge. And then in 2 or 3 years later, here we are again. We're back in this place of being frustrated, of not sure what to do. And the moment that this taught me that I thought was really important was there's moments where you have to break through. If you want to be as successful as a creative, as a designer, or anything else like that, there's moments where you have to break through, where just sort of running away isn't going to be the solution. You've got to step back. You've got to find some different thinking, some different ideation, and find a different way through. And I think that was, for me, why this moment was so important, because of the work that followed was great. But it also was just for me to try to rededicate myself and to not just leave. Because if I would have missed all the amazing stuff that came afterwards. I would have missed what was probably one of the greatest and most fun periods of my entire career. But like I said, it's worth noting that that happened. But what came next was sort of what made all the difference. So coming out of that moment of frustration, of feeling like I needed to break through, we needed a different approach. So what I'd done is I actually had reached out to an agency that I'd seen had been doing some really amazing work called Phenomenon. And I said, look, what we need is I need somebody who can help me create a single source of truth, a real understanding of just what is going on with our customers right now. How can we just bring everybody together to have one conversation? Because as we go through and do research, and again, for me, everything I do is about data and research-informed creativity. That we had been on this mission to be, honestly, the most innovative operator in hospitality. But we were losing that market share and we're losing our innovative edge because our infrastructure was suffering and because we had this really inconsistent implementation that consumers were waiting for us to be that category leader, to be able to provide a digital experience that matched what they got on the property. Something that really kind of gave them that feeling like they were working with somebody who was really out in front. And so what we did over the course of that work, and I wanted to use an external agency to do this because I wanted to be able to take a look at this. I wanted to look at the customer journey to just really understand, where are we? What is going on? Why is it whenever I travel around the company, I'm finding different roadmaps and different versions of what's going on with different interpretations of what consumers are doing, and none of it was lining up or adding up, so we all were having separate conversations and solving separate problems. I wanted a third party to come in to be able to look at with as much data as we could to really just understand what is actually going on. Not what did we tell ourselves, what was actually going on. And so we started with this, where we looked at what was that customer journey that we were trying to take on, of where somebody is aware of our brands, that whenever they go in, they're searching and booking a stay with us, what happens before they get to the hotel, in stay when they're at the hotel, and then what happens after they leave. Now, to be able to do this, we did something that, again, I've done with a lot of other teams that I think works incredibly well. Now, there's a lot of nuance to what goes into this, and I know this looks a little bit like an eye chart, but what we did was we produced this document, which is about 7 feet wide, if you print it out at 100%. And what this is this is based in data, a look at, for each one of these different phases, what are all the different touch points that are going on here, like how big of an experience the orange arrows then actually will help you look at what is really going on there, what are the real paths that are going on here, so we could have one unified look. And then we could do this. We could identify what were the moments where we could win. What were the moments and those opportunities that we could really capitalize on as we went through this whole process. But like I said, this is all about working with everyone. This was not a design exercise. So the other thing that we did was we worked with our tech teams to be able to go in and look at what were the different tech stacks that we had? How did things come together? How did this stuff work? To be able to come together to get a holistic view of all of it. And the other thing that we did was at one point as we were going through this, if you took a step back and you looked at all of it, the thing that you saw was just look at the density of the dots. You see how there's so many of them to the left of this line. Because what we were doing is we were focusing and concentrating on all these moments right up until you hit the book button. And then what happened was after you hit the book button, digital as a channel really fell away and didn't really do much with the guest. So what were we doing? We were investing all this time and all this money in the place where we had the most competition. This is where the Orbits, the Airbnbs, all the booking sites, all our competition were playing in that part. And what we weren't doing was investing in this part, where there was the opportunity, where we could actually say, look, the one thing we own, the one thing that we totally control, is what happens when you're actually at one of our properties. So why don't we invest there? Why don't we own that part of the journey? And so what we did was we had gone through and then actually mapped out for our 4 major touch points, which were at that point web, mobile, email, and sort of various other ones. How did we want to remap those dots? How did we want this actually to work so that as you went through it, we could again identify what were the goals of what we wanted to do? What were the touch points? How did we want to rearrange what was going on so that we had a much clearer sense of what did we want that experience to be? Now with that in mind, now we had the challenge of how do you design an experience that lets that happen, that will take on all those diverse needs. Because again, we were dealing with very, very complicated customer behavior. And that was really what we saw, is that as we went through and did the research, we were putting too much of a burden on the customer. We were asking them to dig through apps, through websites, to be able to find out, when did the restaurant open? When was the pool open? And a lot of these others they may seem small, but in the totality became real burdens that we were putting on them. Because travel is dynamic. It's diverse. You are there for a lot of different reasons. And this was in our early research and our early concepting what we got wrong. Because what we were trying to do is we were trying to concentrate on how everybody was different. How was business travel and family travel and leisure travel and adventure travel? Like, how were those different? How could we cater to those, what all the differences were? Well, the problem was in doing that, the complexity was just too big, that the designs didn't work. That what we needed to have was we needed something that was more dynamic. We needed this so that a single customer who has different intentions, different needs, and different preferences, and even different contexts on a day or even inside of a trip, we needed an experience that could respond to that. So what we did here was, instead of concentrating on the difference, we concentrated on the similarity. Because what we found was, no matter what you were doing, business, family, again, any of these things, you had this set cycle of, there was downtime whenever, maybe you didn't have a trip booked, but you were thinking about it. Maybe you wanted to go someplace in the summer or the fall. Maybe you had an anniversary coming up. There was something. Maybe you had a business trip. And in that downtime, you were just sort of ruminating about what you might want to do. There was planning, where I actually want to go through and say, okay, we want to do this. How do I make it happen? Now then into more of that customer journey that we had before. Great. So I want to search for and book the hotel. There's that time before I get there, whenever I'm there, and after I leave. Now, what we did was we went through for each one of these and identified what was the customer need for each one of these phases. So again, if I'm going through and search and book, I want to be able to search. I want to be able to get offers. I want to be able to look at different rates or different redemption options, because we did have points that you could redeem. And the other thing that we'd done is we had started, we were the first company that was being fully transparent about letting people who stayed at our hotels actually write verified reviews for that. So we wanted to be able to let them look at what were people saying, because even if there were hotels that weren't great, we wanted that level of transparency. We wanted people to know. We wanted those operators to know that was the way people felt. So we did that for every part of this stage. Well, then what we did, and in this case, we'll just sort of look at pre-stay, in-stay, and post-stay, because that's what we'll concentrate on. We mapped those needs to different content and to different functionality. So that what we would do is we would say, okay, before you get to the hotel, maybe there are things that you're going to need, like the address, how to get there. You want to look at photos of what does it look like. You want to be able to look at the rooms or different things like that. Okay, well, after you get there and you've checked in, well, I probably still need the address because I need to figure out where it is I'm going. But now things like photos or looking at the guest rooms, those aren't important. But other things, like your room number or things like that, those actually are now much more important. And then once you've checked out, how do I leave? How do I get back to the airport? How do I write that review? Or how do I share that sort of content? Because we also knew that if we had W in St. Regis, we had brands that had a lot of social currency. So we wanted to tap into that, to let people share out those photos into their social networks, to be able to tap into that whole marketing channel. And this is just sort of a high level and simplified look at that. But it was saying, okay, look, now what we can do is we can evolve what it is we're showing. We can be proactive in really knowing what it is you're going to need, so that then we could surface that information. And we made this simple shift of it being about giving you the content you needed when you needed it. Now, if you've listened to my podcast or seen me talk for any amount of time, you'll often hear me use the phrase, great design is a visual expression of great thinking. Here's another instance of that. Because I think whenever we're able to take a step back to create that single source of truth, to be able to take a step back and rethink just what was the fundamental approach to how we were going to build the app, that was what laid the foundation for all the design work that was to come, because it gave us a different perspective. It gave us a different way of being able to think about it. And that for us, then, it was about how did we then bring this sort of new look at the customer journey to life in the design. So now let's take a look at actually what we did with that and how we brought it to life in the way that we designed the app. So how are we going to bring all this to life? So the design that we ended up going with was this one. And because what we saw was that there were really two primary customer needs, two main things that people were interested in. One was their SPG account. They wanted to see the number of points they had. They wanted to just sort of do some of the basic things, look at offers. Again, when we're in that downtime, when we're in that planning stage, this is what they wanted to focus on. But then we created this system of tabs that you see there on the right-hand side. Now, these tabs would be the things that we could take, we could change, we could reorder, again, depending on what it was you wanted to do. They were simple. You could go through, you could scroll just with your thumb to be able to go through and look at all these. But again, we didn't want them to be too simple, because if they're too simple, you don't know why you should interact with them. And so by just simply going through and adding this second line, just changing the color a little bit, what it was we saw was you could give it context. I could see how many offers there were. I could see the new partnership was with Uber. I could see that there were 6 member favorite lists. So just that simple amount of context made people interact with them far, far more. But then from there, it really became about what did we need to do? Which is, the end of the day, the design was great, but we needed heads in beds. And so what we did was we set about rethinking what was booking really going to look like on mobile. How do we totally change? What were the abilities for the check-in and check-out dates, for number of rooms, adults? Again, setting things like your rate, if you're using a rate preference or different things like that, to keep it simple, to keep it really mobile friendly. But then from there, as we sort of went through and went into this, it also then did become about those tiles. So if I went in and I wanted to look at member favorites, this was that thing that even if I have a trip coming up, even if there are those sort of things, I still like to think. I still like to see what's possible. So even surfacing this sort of content that was always interactive, that again, mobile friendly, was collapsed and condensed, but at any point I could open that up, get a little bit of a visual, be able to explore that list a little bit more, and all these tabs were interactive in that way where you could go through and open and close them. It worked really well. Well, then there was the other half of this, which was really about your stays, and so your upcoming stays. So the next stay that you had coming up, we always wanted to feature. We wanted to obviously give you the dates and where it was, and even give you a glimpse into the room. Because that was one of the things that we had to really be mindful of, is that hotel travel is extremely personal. Whenever you leave the safety of your home and you go stay in a hotel, that hotel becomes a home surrogate, right? It becomes that place that you're going to be able to stay, and it's where you want that sort of safety and privacy and recognition. Like, a lot of those sort of things need to happen there. So we wanted to be able to give you a glimpse of what was that going to look like. Secondary stays were then made a little bit more simple and something you could just simply scroll through. Digging into one of them, then you can actually start to see a change. And what that change really was there was, it was much more then about, and we talked about, the complexity of our brands. We would move from the Starwood Preferred Guest state, because what that did is that let us build the brand equity in SPG. It let us be able to bring all the brands together. But then in that moment, whenever you were going to interact with a hotel or a particular brand, now what we were able to do is, by changing the typeface, by changing colors and a few simple things, we could suddenly make it feel much more like a St. Regis experience. A big part of this for us was to make it so that templates weren't a bad word. Because I think for so many designers, it's like templates and they roll their eyes, we're just going to hammer out the same thing time and time again. Well, no, for us, we wanted to be able to actually use this, to have this freedom and a framework, and to be able to have this sort of thing where you could see what was going on. But now this is where we started to really play with and curate that content. So before you got there, if it was 48 hours before, there were things you could do, like register for keyless entry, look at directions and transportations. That Apple Wallet or Passbook at that point was definitely a big thing, so you wanted to be able to go in and be able to pull that out. Again, looking at offers and guest services and things like that. Well, now, whenever you're within 48 hours of the stay, now, again, that ability to just focus it in a little bit more, now, keyless and directions, those become the top 2 things that people care about. And that actually now, okay, we'll say you've gotten to the hotel and you've checked in. Well, now it changes again, because where you saw on the left originally, it was the name of the hotel and the address. Okay, now you know where it is. So now what we want to be able to do is to try to give you an offer to be able to honestly get you to spend a little bit more while you're on the property. But now things like keyless entry and your room number, those became visible. Again, guest services became a much higher in the stack, because what do we want you to do? We want you to be able to understand, what do we have to offer? And there were different things like that became available. And then once you've checked out, we change again. Now the top 2 tiles become about writing a review and taking a survey. Here again, directions and transportation about how to get back to the airport, cashing in on that social media to be able to post photos, and again, if there are any messages or policies about you left something in the room, the hotel can let you know. But it was this ability to take this one layout and this one concept and to have it be so dynamic, to have it be able to do so many different things. One was, again, this was a big part of working with our engineering team to understand that if we stuck to this sort of a system, that it made it much easier. We could solve the brand problem, and that, again, we could now start to curate and surface a very complicated stack of information as something that was much similar. Now, here again, as we would go from, we'll say, a St. Regis to a Le Méridien. Here again, the simple change of the addition of a logo, the Le Méridien Bora Bora in a different typeface, changing the color of the tiles, makes it feel like a different brand. And so here again, you can see it with W. Now, one of the best customer insights that we found, and again, I think these are the things that are only possible whenever you really are obsessed with your customer, and probably the number one feature that everybody loved was the ability to just simply have the address in the local language. Because what it was we realized was if you're traveling to another country where the language you speak is not the primary language, so let's say I went to China and I was in Beijing and I jump into the back of a cab. I don't speak Mandarin. So how do I actually figure out how to get to the hotel? Because while no, that is not on our property, it is definitely a part of your journey. And so just the ability of having something as simple as that address in the local language, if you tapped on it, it would bring it up on a map, made that part of getting to the hotel so much simpler and so much stress-free. And again, it was one of those things where most people would have never thought that was something they needed until you're in the moment, until you realize you don't speak the language and the panic sets in and you're not sure what to do. Then again, we had already thought that through and we're there to be able to help. But we also did this, like I said, in 14 different languages, so that there were versions that we did in Chinese and Japanese. These were not just simply reskins and putting it into another language. This was actually going through, and in this case, looking at as you work with Asian consumers in that design, there's just some different things you need to do. The way they deal with pagination and content is very different. And we'd also built a full version in Android. This wasn't just iOS. So again, doing this, looking at the way Android worked, to be able to create something that worked for that operating system and wasn't just some port of iOS onto Android. But then we also came to work on keyless entry. Now, this was something nobody said, hey, look, you know these little plastic keys? It'd be great if we had a different way of doing that. But for us, we really felt like this was one of those moments. If you've just come off a long flight, if you get to the hotel and there's a long line, that ability to just be able to sort of take control in that moment, to be able to register for this, be able to have already checked in, know what your room number is, have your room key. It's just, again, one less moment of stress in that process. And this was really the thing where a big part of this as well was an evolution and a pivot in our approach. Because up until then, traditionally what we had done is we would come up with an idea that we really liked, and we would often go set out to try to launch it to all of our hotels, which at that time was somewhere north of 1,500. Well, the problem was that what resulted is it would take 2 to 3 years to be able to roll any of this stuff out. So by then, that sort of innovation had been lost. Any competitive edge we had was gone. We were trying to then troubleshoot problems or things that came up at a scale that just made it so difficult. So whenever it came to keyless, we just said, look, let's just do this totally differently. Let's take, again, more of that design thinking approach to this. Instead of starting with 1,500, let's start with 2. So we started with one in Harlem, New York, and as the story goes on, not surprisingly, one in Cupertino, California. And so here again, this was the place where we were able to seamlessly add this into the interface, because when we launched it, keyless wasn't a thing. Well, that really became the power of this concept, was that we could lay any new functionality, any new program, any new thing on top of this, and all we needed to do is to figure out what was the right moment to surface it and where did it go in the stack. So that, again, it gave us a huge amount of that ability to be more nimble and to be able to pivot and to be able to evolve, to use that research and those sort of things to make it better. So here again, you would get this tab that we saw before where you could register for keyless. Whenever you had gone through that process, it gave you the ability, whenever you were on, we used a geofence to be able to do this, you would get a tab that gave you your room key and your room number, which again, room number is one of the highest requested pieces of information that you get at the front desk. Again, that time sitting in the lobby of the Westin Governor Morris paid off. And then what you'd be able to do is once you tapped on that, you could go through and be able to see your room number. The reveal of the room number was always something that you had to do. It never appeared in a notification. It never appeared. We wanted to be incredibly conscious of always being safe with what this was, that it never was revealed so that someone could accidentally see it. whenever you triggered this, there would actually be 3 dots on top of that, and you'd have to hit the show your room number button if you wanted to see it. You had the mobile key, and all you'd have to do is hold that up to the door would unlock. But the approach let us be able to work through a lot of, honestly, just use cases that we never would have considered. We saw things like, great, you've gotten to your room, you unlocked the door, you went inside. Maybe you started to unpack, your phone is in your pocket, and you go to walk into the bathroom. Well, the way the sensor was set up, it would still detect the key because maybe you hadn't closed that out and your door would unlock unintentionally with you in the room. Other things, like now we needed to basically turn the front desk into a low-grade Genius bar because there we needed to be able to get the front desk to understand how to work with Bluetooth and work with the app. A lot of training had to go into there. How did it work in an elevator? We would often have the sensor where you'd have to be able to unlock it to get to the floor. Now that meant I'm working with groups. Maybe it's harder to get as close to the sensor as what we would want. Plus, there were pools and gyms and a lot of other things, but by doing it in that sort of way of just doing it with those 2 places, that let us really go through and be able to really refine what it was we were doing. And so the results of that just sort of first wave of work really came through because, one of the biggest ones was that within 6 months of that launch, we went from what had been under the previous app, 80,000 users, to 5 million users within the space of about 6 months. And 5 million users at that time represented about half of the total customer base for Starwood Preferred Guest. But we also saw within that 6 months that globally for Android and iOS, that 2-star app went to 5 stars and stayed there for years. Because for us, it really was about how we were just doing something different. We were, again, giving them that value, trading on that insight, using that research to make it better. And that was what really, really came through, was that approach by coming back, having that single source of truth, and this approach really paid off. So the design of the app was a real breakthrough in that ability to proactively give the consumer what they want when they wanted it. To rethink what was an interface, to rethink how did we bring all those brands together. There was a lot of work and a lot of innovation that went into that. But whenever it came to Apple Watch and the ability to launch that app, that was going to be a whole different set of challenges and a whole different set of thinking that we were going to be able to do to be able to take what we built and make it work in this all-new form factor. And I think more than anything, it was one of the most interesting, challenging, fun, adventurous, amazing experiences that, again, I don't know we've ever really told the behind-the-scenes story of, but yeah, let's jump into to what happened with SPG for Apple Watch. And then we come to Apple Watch. Now, obviously, there are going to be parts about this whole process I'm never going to be able to talk about, and I'm not going to start here. But Apple Watch was really interesting because in a lot of cases, here again, as we look to constantly evolve, constantly research, constantly be obsessed with our customer, the thing that we saw was that we needed to start to really rethink and have a different understanding of how did people use apps. Because as we went through and did that, we saw that actually customers would use different mobile platforms for different phases of the journey, and they would use it to book stays on different time horizons. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. But what that really is that, so as we looked at our 4 major touch points, web, tablet, phone, and watch, the thing that we saw was setting them apart was that time horizon. And what that meant was if you went on to our website, what you would do is that you would use that to think about, search, and book a stay for about a year in the future. So a very, very long timeline. It was really focused on that downtime awareness, search, and booking. Now for tablets, that was something where people wanted a bit more of an editorial approach. The time they were looking for there was about 3 months, mainly leisure focused. So for them, we needed something that was more editorial, more focused on downtime, more focused on awareness with some searching and booking. The behavior that we saw that was not what we expected was around the phone, because we thought we would see similar behaviors on the phone app. But when you started to really look at it, this is where you started to see that people were really only booking on the phone for a window of about 10 days. So we actually holistically changed the app. So where it used to be able to let you book for months, we would just concentrate on a 10-day window so that all the offers and the availability were focused on a 10-day window. If you wanted something larger than that, then we would direct you to the tablet or to the web experience. But for us, it really was about that search and book in a 10-day window, and then the experience that we saw about pre-stay, in-stay, and post-stay. Now, here was where, and we didn't know it at the time, that proactive content curation was really going to come in and be really important. Because as you look at wearables are about what am I doing right now? that it is an average interaction window of about 5 to 7 seconds. So very, very quick. Very short, very snackable information about what am I doing right now. So that was what we needed to focus on whenever we started doing the watch. But the watch started in a much funnier and more interesting way, because Apple Watch actually started here with Google Glass. Now, this was a case where nobody at the company said, hey, we think it's a good idea to build an app for this, or that this was something that we felt like we wanted to engage in. I really felt like that wearables were going to be the next big thing, that this was going to be something we had to pay attention to. I don't think that I ever looked at Glass and thought, wow, this is going to be the next platform, or that there aren't some fatal mistakes that they are making on this. But what I did think was that this is the first viable consumer device that I can get my hands on that we can work on. So my team and I went together, we put together the application to be a part of the Glass Explorer program, and we got one. And so then over the course of the next few months, myself and our head of engineering spent a lot of nights and a lot of weekends crafting basically a skunkworks version of what would a wearable SPG app look like. And we built this all the way through. So SPG for Glass was a real app that actually launched on their app store. And you could go through and you could be able to search. You could be able to explore different properties. We actually took it so far as to figure out if there was a property you liked. We actually did an end-to-end booking flow where we could then hand off what you're doing on Glass into a call center so that you could actually complete one of those things all the way through. So that, again, it was an end-to-end, completely wearable booking experience. Well, the reality was, like I said, that the reason why we did that was we wanted the experience. And so then the interesting part was then there were a lot of rumors about maybe Apple was going to do this thing with a watch. Maybe they thought they were going to do it. Maybe they didn't know. So unbeknownst to most everybody in the company, I secretly emailed our contacts at Apple. And what I said was like, hey, I know that there are these rumors that this is going on. I'm not asking you to confirm anything. All I'm saying is if these are true, here's some of the ideas of what we might do. Lo and behold, we end up getting the call, myself, our head of engineering, and we show up in Cupertino and start working on the watch. Now, the one part of this process that I think is worth calling out, because again, I think it is really, really good, is that we're working in a very secure environment. So you don't have a lot to be able to work with. In the beginning of the process, we didn't even have hardware to work with. And so, myself and my head of engineering, we're sort of sitting there going, look, we need to start designing and building something. We need to start thinking of something. And we sort of understand generally it's like this thing with a small screen, but how do we understand it? How do we relate to it? And we'd had this, I think was just an amazing idea, was as we looked around the room, we found these two things, a sugar packet and a rubber band. And what we would do is whenever people would come in who had seen the hardware, we would hold up the sugar packet and we would say, is this about how big the device is? And they go, a little bit smaller. And we'd roll down the top. And they'd come in again and they go, hey, how about now? And we go, maybe not quite that wide. We'd roll it down a little bit. So we spent probably about 2 weeks walking around with a sugar packet rubber banded to our arm to try to understand what was this relationship going to be like? How did we start to work through this? We had all that experience from Glass to be able to draw on of what is it like to be able to have a piece of technology physically on you, but we just wanted to be able to start rethinking what that process was. And that then led us into really understanding what to do. And for us, the first line of interaction that we started to work with was notifications. And these were those moments of, again, how do we bring to life those sort of that proactive content curation? So there are things like, again, whenever we see that you've arrived in the city. So again, just this simple like geolocation pull. That here again, you get the address in the local language and transportation options. Thanks to a geofence, we could see whenever you would arrive at the hotel. The first time we'd give you your confirmation number, the second time we'd give you your room number, give you the ability to unlock the door. And then from there, also to celebrate other moments. So if you had a tier change, if you became SPG Gold, that felt like something we wanted to be able to call out. One of the biggest things that we had was people would constantly call our call centers wanting to know if their points had posted. Some people would literally check out, walk out of the lobby into the driveway, call the call center and see if their points had posted yet. Okay, great. Well, let's reduce that call center volume by whenever your points posted, you knew the second it hit the system, it would show up on your watch. And then here again, it was that quest to be able to make templates not a bad word. So the ability to take one layout, have one for 4 points, a totally different one for St. Regis, and another one for Le Méridien, where again, same layout, and just through the use of color, texture, and different things like that, we could get different looks and feels. But then as we got into the actual watch app, the app had 4 different states. the state whenever you had stays coming up, whenever you were in stay, no stay, and logged out. We're just going to look at 2 of these. So what we actually did was whenever you'd go in and you would launch the app, here again, this is about 5 to 7 second interaction windows. So if I have stays that are coming up, again, whenever I get there, small photo, you can see the hotel, the dates. This was trying, again, to be very respectful that we knew that, again, this thing's got to have a small battery. So I want to use dark colors, minimal photography. I want to respect the battery life of the device so that whenever you go through, because what I don't want to be is that app that everybody loves, but it crushes your battery. So even though I love it, I'm going to uninstall it. So again, simple design, muted colors. Here again, that ability to be able to see the things that mattered, your name, your points, how many different nights and stays that you have. We had a maximum of 4 stays because that's all anybody really cared about, again, in that time horizon. But it was simple, and it really gave you the ability to be able to have real interactions. Now here again, as we would leap out of each one of these experiences, now again, we got into same template, different color, different photography, different branding, different feeling experience. So what that would let us do is, again, use one simple template and be able to then reuse it to give you a lot of different experiences. If you were in stay, now what we focused on was what mattered there. So that was triggered by a geofence. So again, your room number, the ability to unlock your doors. You could still see all your upcoming stays. But a lot of this then was, and I think the biggest thing we did was to make it work with keyless. So you'd walk up, you'd hit the button to unlock your door, hold the watch up, the door would open, and in you'd go. Felt like magic. The funny part about this was how many people this frustrated and confused. Because the thing was, you could not, and we even could not access the Bluetooth, which we would normally use to send the key to the lock. So we had to figure out another way of doing this. And the funny part to me about this is that it is so simple and so obvious that nobody was seemingly able to figure out how we did it. So many people got pissed off because they thought we had some special access to the Bluetooth. That's not what we did at all. What we did is we figured out that the lock needs some amount of metal to wake up the sensor. To protect the battery life, the sensor doesn't ping all the time. It needs something to disrupt a magnetic field, and then it wakes it up. Well, the watch had enough metal in it to wake up the sensor. So what had happened was you would hit the button and hold the watch up to the lock. At that point, the watch would wake up the lock, which would start scanning. At the same point, the watch would then send a message to your phone saying, hey, look, we need to unlock the door. All that we did was we had the phone still send the key, but instead of using a very low power, much closer Bluetooth proximity, we would jack it up so that what it let it do would be, whether it was in your back pocket or a suitcase or a briefcase, it would still unlock the door. It would send the key, the door would unlock, and it would go in. It made it look like the watch had done all of this, whenever the watch had done basically almost none of it. And that was the funny part, was it was just people's feeling that it had done this, that made it feel so magical and so different. And again, it couldn't have been a more simple way to be able to do it, even though, again, there's a lot of work that went into it, so I don't want to oversimplify it. But again, we didn't do some, elaborate thing or go around the rules. And again, just for me, this is my favorite moment. So this is Bobby, who is on the right. That was our head of engineering. He was the one who did all the coding, did all this technical heavy lifting. That is the look of a man who has spent so many nights at 2 and 3 in the morning creeping around inside of a hotel trying to get this code to work. And that's the first time it actually worked. And so I think that's still a moment that I absolutely love. And oh, by the way, that sugar packet, it's funny how close that actually ended up to being exactly the right size of the watch whenever we got to see it, whenever the rest of the world got to see it. And I still think this is one of my favorite photos of just, again, how a little ingenuity and a little prototyping can go a really long way. Well, that was it. And like I said, I think hopefully for me, I wanted to dive in beyond just the design. I want to talk about the problems. I want to talk about the way that the teams came together, about how did we create things like that single source of truth, about rethinking the model, how we had to work together, be ingenious, do a lot of these things through the way, and in many cases even work on things that maybe at the moment didn't make sense, but only down the road did people start to really understand why we were doing them. Because I think more than anything for me, that's one of the biggest things that this whole thing taught me, was that things that are success, things that people think are smart or innovative or whatever it is, they only think that way after you did it. That whenever you're going through it, whenever you're doing that work, when you're doing those things, it never really feels like, yes, this is the right way or this is the way we should do it. Because in many cases, you're doing things either you haven't done before, maybe nobody's done before. But that concept of it being a success, that only happens in hindsight. But again, it was a lot of work, a lot of collaboration, so many amazing people that I got to be able to work with that made this happen, to be able to pull it off and to be able to, at so many points when it could have gone wrong, it didn't. And I think that way, hopefully, you're able to get a sense of a little bit more of what actually goes into bringing that idea to market and to really launch. So hopefully that was helpful. I think, look, if everybody likes this, if this video does well, I'll be happy to do more of these. If it's something that you're interested in, again, I try to create a lot of different content here. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell so that you'll find out whenever I make more videos like this. Also, feel free to check out The Crazy One, which is also a podcast I've been doing for over 4 years. We talk a lot about creativity, leadership, design, career coaching, a whole bunch of other stuff there. But hopefully you like this. Hopefully it was helpful and be able to give you some insight into what actually went on behind the scenes for a lot of this stuff. And thanks for watching. And as always, stay crazy.